I'm Jessica Jordan. You're listening to American Edition on the Voice of Russia. Well, in light of the upcoming anniversary this week of the September 11th attacks, we're taking a look back at how the event changed the U.S. in terms of stepped-up security measures across the country, a rise in Islamophobia, and the passing of such legislation as the Patriot Act. My guests are Dr. Jim Carafano. He is a deputy director at the Heritage Foundation. I'm also joined on the line by Daryl Johnson. He's founder of DT Analytics, and Daryl has worked as an intelligence analyst for several federal agencies for more than 2 decades. Welcome to both of you, and thanks so much for joining me.
It's good to be with you.
Thank you, Jessica.
Dr. Jim Carafano, let's start with you. After the attacks, we saw stepped-up security across the country. Airport security got tighter. The New York City Police Department created its counterterrorism unit. Do you believe the priority for stepped-up security is still present today with government organizations and businesses as much as it was in those years right after the attacks?
I don't think so. I mean, I think in many ways America changed less than many people were worried about. Having said that, when you look at 11 years later, what you have is this kind of admixture of continuing to do things that make sense, some things that we haven't done that we should do better, some silly things that we should have stopped a long time ago. So it is a bit of a mixed bag.
What do you think are some of those things that maybe we should have stopped doing a long time ago, or where do things need to be stepped up in terms of security?
Well, I'll give you an example of some things that you kind of scratch your head and you ask, well, why are we doing this or why are we trying to do this? So one is we very quickly rolled out a very aggressive program to do radiological screening on material coming in the United States looking for dirty bombs and nuclear weapons. First of all, it's probably if somebody did have one of those things and they were trying to smuggle them, it's probably not how they would do that. I think the technologies are questionable value, so you do cost-benefit analysis of all the money and workforce that we put into that versus what do we actually get out of that. I'm not really sure it's worth it. So if you look at L.A. Long Beach, for example, a third of the workforce is looking for a nuclear weapon. And look, if a terrorist group had a nuclear weapon, probably the least likely thing they would do with it was put it in a shipping container, which they didn't have positive control over, and which shipping containers get lost, crushed, stolen, misplaced, misdirected, and just kind of wave goodbye to it. I mean, they would obviously smuggle it through some manner of positive control. And the way you're going to find nuclear smuggling and stop it is going out and looking for the people trying to do that. We spend a lot of money on that, and that's something I'm not really sure where we get the benefit.
Daryl Johnson, how do you weigh in on that? Do you agree with some of the things that have been said in terms of we're still taking actions that maybe are unnecessary? And do you think there's still more that we should do in certain aspects of combating terrorism?
Well, I think the primary thing that we need to do is start balancing our counterterrorism approach and stop focusing solely on Muslim extremist violence and start looking at some of the domestic non-Islamic extremist violence that we have in this country. So there needs to be a little more balanced approach. It seems like after 9/11 and leading up to the past few years, the U.S. counterterrorism efforts have been solely focused or at least overemphasizing the threat from Muslim extremists.
We know the Patriot Act expanded the definition of terrorism to include domestic terrorism. What about this homegrown terrorism? How prevalent is it today? Daryl Johnson?
Well, basically, homegrown terrorism can be broken down into 2 broad groups. We have the homegrown Muslim extremists, and we have domestic non-Islamic extremists. On the Muslim side, since 9/11, we've had only 5 confirmed attacks that were actually carried out by homegrown Muslim extremists. Now, compare that to a couple of dozen that we've had since the 2008 presidential election. So there tends to be a lot less actual attacks by Muslim extremists here in America than there are from non-Muslims.
Yeah, I'm not so sure I completely agree with that data.
This is Dr. Jim Carafano.
It can explain the right way. I mean, we track Islamist-inspired plots against the United States, both internally and the ones from abroad. By our count, there's been at least 51 plots aimed at the United States since 9/11 that have been thwarted. The majority of those actually are domestic, and the numbers have actually increased in recent years. Not that they've been, very sophisticated plots. But I don't think. But on the other hand, to say we shouldn't worry about that, I don't think it's fair. But to say we shouldn't worry about domestic extremism either is I don't think it's fair to say that we're not. Yeah, we have more domestic extremist plots from non-Muslim groups because we got zillions of kinds of groups. Those we've always had those. We'll continue to have those.
But we see more frequent threats, do you think, with those other
I don't think
groups?
there's any data to suggest that domestic extremism from a variety of sources is any higher today than it was, say, 10 years ago. I mean, I actually think we had much higher levels of domestic extremism 10, 15, or 20 years ago than we do now.
Daryl Johnson, in looking at those two different groups where we do see acts of terrorism, how are the attacks different and the goals of those attacks? How are those different? Or in some cases, are they the same?
All right. There's basically the threat from Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, okay? You're basically looking at a mass casualty-producing event, okay? These tend to be low in probability but high in consequence if they do occur, such as the 9/11 attacks. On the flip side, the Muslim extremists here in America have pretty much carried out similar types of attacks as their domestic non-Islamic counterparts. We're talking about shooting attacks. We're talking about small bombings, things of this nature. So, from a homegrown perspective, Muslims and non-Islamic have basically similar tactics and tradecraft. However, the overseas groups like Al-Qaeda have a lot more emphasis on mass casualty-producing events.
Yeah, I don't think that's correct either. For example, we had the attempted or planned attack on JFK in New York. That was a mass casualty-producing event, and several of the other extremist plots involved mass, or events where they were trying to increase casualty. So I'm not really sure. And to say things are high consequence and low probability, I mean that's a meaningless statement because you can't compute probability on those things. And in a lot of cases, they're less of a threat because we've been thwarting them.
Well, a couple of things I'd like to respond to that. Number one, most of the things you're talking about never occurred, okay? Plotting can be coached by the FBI, which we've seen in a number of cases, including that New York plot you just referenced. So to sit there and say that the FBI is going to supply you with an inert surface-to-air missile, okay, which has capability whatsoever, I think is a farce.
Well, first of all, it wasn't a surface-to-air missile attack. They were going to go after pipelines. And the FBI didn't give them that idea either.
What about sting operations that are used today where law enforcement officials engage suspected terrorists? Are we still seeing this method used, and has there not been controversy surrounding this method? Dr. Carafano, we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, operations you have to define what you mean. If somebody has an intent of doing an illegal act, and in the course of an investigation, you uncover that by encouraging them to act on that intent. That's perfectly legitimate. It's a proven law enforcement technique. We do it all kinds of the time for all kinds of crimes. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I mean, so as long as it's done in a lawful manner, as a lawful investigative tool, there's nothing wrong with it. Not only is there nothing wrong with it, it's proven to have uncovered several people that wanted to kill Americans, and their plots were stopped, and they were taken to court and convicted of a crime.
Daryl Johnson.
Given the same resources and the same emphasis that the FBI puts on Islamic extremists, I could come up with probably dozens of cases. If I use the same techniques, if I walk up to a white supremacist and basically tell them, hey, I see that you're against the U.S. and that you want to bomb minorities. Here's a truck bomb for you to carry out your attack. So if the emphasis was put on the non-Islamic extremists and using the same techniques and tactics that the FBI is using, you could come up with similar dozens of plots that we've seen since 9/11, allegedly perpetrated by these Muslim extremists.
What can you give us some examples there?
I'm just talking hypothetics. If you give me the same resources and same emphasis that people have put on the Muslim extremist threat, I could produce dozens of similar plots by non-Islamic.
One aspect, I wanted to touch upon this too, Daryl Johnson, because you've been looking at this. One aspect of the fallout from the 9/11 attacks is the rise of Islamophobia. How do you explain the rise of this, and who typically is involved in this type of prejudice that we see?
Well, basically, what we've seen since 9/11, there was a backlash against Muslims. We had several hate crimes where people were targeted because they either thought the people were Muslim or they were actually Muslim themselves. We're basically seeing an uptick now where we've had over 14 attacks, arson attacks against mosques here in the U.S. within the past year and a half. We've also had an attempted bombing. And so, we've seen another, surge here on anti-Islamic sentiment that has spilled over into violence.
And another point that has really come out of the September 11th attacks is the Patriot Act. Dr. Carafano, I wanted to go back and talk about the passing of the Patriot Act and how that legislation changed the ability of law enforcement agencies to gather intelligence within the U.S. What are the major changes that we saw take place there with the passing of that?
Well, primarily what the Patriot Act did was take law enforcement investigative authorities, which were already available to U.S. law enforcement, had been tested in courts in which there were investigative procedures established for, and allowed them to use those for investigating the crime of terrorism. That's fundamentally what the law did. It's fundamentally how the law has been used, and part of the reason why there's never been a successful constitutional challenge against the Patriot Act.
In what way? Did it enable? What ways did it enable law enforcement to really, I guess, have additional tools in the toolbox to be able to go after people who would be responsible for terrorist activity if given the chance to move forward with some of those activities?
Sure. So one authority that it gave, for example, was called a delayed notification warrant. And that's a kind of a warrant that's, again, been in existence for a long time. And it basically says, well, there are situations where you wouldn't publicly want to make knowledge of that warrant. Say somebody might be killed, evidence might be destroyed, it might hinder a prosecution. So you still have to get the warrant, but you get a period of time that the judge allows for you, in a sense, not to publicly announce that warrant. So the ability to use delayed notification warrants for investigating terrorist crimes, that was an additional authority that was granted under the Patriot Act.
Have we seen that legislation be able to come into play in terms of not only Muslim extremist groups, but also anti-government groups here in the U.S.? We'll start with you, Daryl Johnson. That legislation,
I don't know specifically whether the Patriot Act has been used against some of the anti-government and racist groups we have in the U.S. Basically what these groups are prosecuted under our current firearms and explosives violations.
That's what I was curious about. Yeah, what type of? Yeah, I was curious which type of legislation kind of comes into play with that, or what authorities law enforcement really have to go after those particular groups.
It's primarily in the U.S. Code. We have firearms violations that occur as well as explosive violations. Occasionally, you'll get penalty enhancements if it's a hate crime. So the Matthew Shepard Act, as well as some of the other hate legislation that's out there.
If we could just go back to the Islamophobia for a second. I just Googled very quickly and found about a dozen examples of attacks against U.S. churches in the United States this year, which sounds about the same number as the attack against mosques. I think the answer is hate crimes are wrong, no matter who they're committed against for whatever reason, and that we ought to reasonably expect law enforcement to pursue all these things.
When we look at this greater picture, though, of combating terrorism post 9/11, a lot of people say, in just looking at the particular situation of airport security, that some freedoms are given up or, some rights of individuals are given up when we do see stepped up security measures or increased efforts to fight terrorism. What are your thoughts on that? I wanted to get you both to weigh in real quick. We've got about a minute left. Dr. Carafano?
Yeah, so just very quickly, I think we have to make a distinction between being inconvenienced and a violation of our freedoms. You have a lower expectation of privacy at certain places. This is what the courts have ruled: crossing a border, getting on an airplane. So so your freedoms haven't been diminished. Now, your convenience has been diminished, and I think I'm sympathetic of that, particularly at the airports, where I'm not really sure that all this additional mess has really added much security.
Daryl Johnson?
I pretty much agree. There hasn't been a single bomb that I'm aware of that's been smuggled within the U.S. onto a plane, so why are we subjecting ourselves to all these screening efforts?
That's Daryl Johnson. He's founder of DT Analytics. Daryl has worked as an intelligence analyst for several federal agencies for more than 2 decades. I've also been on the line with Dr. Jim Carafano. He's a deputy director at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks so much to both of you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.